Thank you very much for organizing this and for inviting me to come today. And it's very wonderful to be amongst people again. This is very nice. And yes, the book about Monsieur is finished and will arrive November 17th, if anybody's interested in looking at
exactly the date.
Yeah, exactly the date, November 17th is what Routledge has said. Which is Ascension Day, no, Accession Day in England for Queen Elizabeth I. And it's my mother's birthday. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming to Versailles, or those of you who are listening online. The paper that I'm going to give now is really a quite quick overview, as I often like to do. The main takeaway points that I'm going to think about really are maintaining princes in restoration. There are two restorations or new regimes of dukes who get their establishment in the early 18th century. So I'm going to focus on both Duke Leopold and the ex-king Stanislas Leszczyński from Poland. So really, I'm mostly going to be talking about people and institutions and the buildings that they're trying to upkeep, rather than the more minute details of how they're actually maintaining these buildings. So it's really about maintaining the presence socially rather than physically and with buildings and gardeners. But those people are all going to be as part of this journey. So with that to start, I think over the next few days, we're certainly going to be learning a lot about many details and methods employed to sustain the presence and reputations of princes in all of their domains, from Spain to Bavaria, Denmark to Naples, and of course, France and Versailles. The variety of royal and princely domains surveyed here will include several models, with some constant features, notably a central urban palace, a predominant rural residence, and several other residences of varying styles and importance, as well as many other spaces for princely patronage, such as convents, hunting grounds, and houses for favorites. The Duchy of Lorraine in the first half of the 18th century is no exception. But what perhaps makes this region more interesting is that it was a composite state. Okay, move there. Lorraine and Bar, which I'm mostly going to just say Lorraine, but I'll always mean Lorraine and Barrois or Bar, separate duchies with the same duke. And thus it had two capitals and two main princely residences in Nancy and Bar-le-Duc. But even more challenging in terms of running a centralized state is the fact that within the territory of the dukes were the three bishoprics of Metz, Toul, and Verdun, plus a few tiny microstates like Commercy, Salm, Fenetrange, and Sarverden. This challenge for the princely dynasty is in converse an opportunity for the local nobility. Although the main employer for the duchies was the ducal court, predominantly at Luneville after 1702, there were also smaller courts maintained by the three bishops and the smaller princes like Salm. Each of these had stables, equerries, gentlemen of the chamber, gardeners, masters of the hunt, and so on. There were also imperial abbeys, more independent than their counterparts in France. So, for example, the Princess Abbess of Remiremont, usually a princess of the House of Lorraine, maintained her own small court, again with equerries, gardeners, and so on. Finally, an ambitious nobleman looking for patronage or employment could travel a bit further afield to the princely court of the Rohan cardinals in Strasbourg, four in succession from the same family, or to the courts of the Habsburg governors in Luxembourg or the Elector Archbishop of Trier. Often possessing lands across the frontier in Champagne, nobles might also travel to Versailles, where there was always a significant Lorraine presence. So this is one of the reasons that I think it's so important for someone like Duke Leopold, born and raised in Innsbruck and Vienna, to try to really work very hard once he's reestablished after 1698 in Lorraine, to keep the local nobility present, to keep them from going away to these other centers of power, and in order to retain their loyalty and therefore his reputation as a prince. It was less important for Stanislas Leszczyński, the former king of Poland, who reigned as Duke of Lorraine and Bar from 1737 to 1766. He had no dynasty whose reputation needed to be sustained in order to preserve its independence. His court thus lost its political and diplomatic importance, but was therefore able to shine even more brilliantly as a center for learning, artistic patronage, and pure pleasure. Indeed, Stanislas established his reputation for posterity, which in a way overshadowed Leopold until a revival of academic and popular interest of the Duke and his regime in this last 2 decades. An added twist that makes the exploration of a multipolar court like Lorraine even more interesting is that there were at times multiple dynasties and dynastic interests at play. Although for the most part, the transferal of the duchies from the last Duke, Francis III, to King Stanislas in 1737 was complete and without incident, for a few years certainly there was a certain overlap. For example, the Duke's mother, Leopold's widow, Elizabeth Charlotte d'Orléans, continued to reside in the nearby Principality of Commercy, technically as a sovereign, though minuscule, and she maintained her sizable household there. Her daughter continued to rule as abbess in Remiremont, and her youngest son, Charles Alexandre, remained proprietor of a chateau in Luneville, La Favorite, though he resided in Brussels as Governor General of the Austrian Netherlands from 1744. Even from Vienna, Francis III, now Emperor Francis I, continued to maintain an interest in the upkeep of his dynastic necropolis at the Cordeliers Church in Nancy, sending inspectors as late as 1760. In 1770, his daughter, Marie Antoinette, would pay a ceremonial visit to this site on her way to Versailles at the time of her marriage. Just around the corner from this church, however, Stanislas also made his mark indelibly on the city of Nancy by his major construction of the town's layout, or reconstruction of the town's layout, with the new Palais du Gouverneur and a new grand square, which at the time was called the Place Royale, though we know it today as the Place Stanislas. So that simply reaffirms this idea that Stanislas is the one that they remember mostly in Lorraine, which I think he would find very funny. What I'd like to do today really is to explore some of this diversity, the Lorraine of Leopold and the Lorraine of Stanislas. One of the reasons I enjoy studying Lorraine and Bar so much is that while there are certainly points of comparison and emulation between the court of Lorraine and that of Versailles, indeed the Palace of Luneville is sometimes called the Versailles Lorrain, there are also characteristics that differ and remind us that although it was a mostly autonomous state, legally Lorraine remained part of the Holy Roman Empire until 1737, and roughly 1/3 of its nobles hailed from the Germanophone regions of the duchy's northeast corner, and thus retained some of the noble customs and practices of their neighbors in the Palatinate or in Baden. These include things like partible inheritance practices and the careful guarding of the 16 quarters that were needed to enter into royal abbeys like Remiremont. Duke Leopold, for example, maintained 2 chief secretaries on his payroll, one for French and one for German affairs. The composite state of Lorraine and Bar was created in the 15th century in the joining of these 2 duchies through marriage and inheritance by Duke René I. The Ducal Palace in Nancy was his main residence when he was in the region. He was also, of course, the Count of Provence and the King of Sicily, so he wasn't always here. But his other residence was his maternal inheritance, which was the Palace of Bar-le-Duc, which I'll talk to shortly. Like many medieval principalities, there were also appanage territories with castles and lands that had been carved out of the ducal domain, such as the county of Vaudémont, the county of Blamont, and the marquisate of Hattonchâtel. The latter had, until the mid-16th century, been the chief residence of the Bishop of Metz. The temporal lands of the Prince Bishops of Metz were the largest of the 3 bishoprics, which, as imperial, not French bishops, operated as independent princes. This was usually not a problem for the dukes, as the bishops were usually a member of the dynasty or someone they nominated. This changed drastically from 1552 when the French king annexed the 3 bishoprics. As said before, this heightened level of rivalry between Lorraine and France in terms of patronage, in fact, served the local nobility well and could hedge their bets by placing sons in service in either location. This is therefore the general landscape inherited by Duke Leopold when he was restored to his duchies following the Treaty of XIVe-XIXe in 1697. Right away, he set out to restore and rebuild the duchies after nearly 70 years of occupation. He first focused on Nancy, planning to extend and rebuild the Ducal Palace and to finally construct a long-desired primatial church, which would serve as the main ecclesiastical center for the duchy, negating the power of the French-nominated bishops who were nearby in Toul. That's a whole different story, the fact that Lorraine is always asking the Pope for a bishop and always being denied one again and again. So Toul maintains its control. He began plans on the primatial church in 1703, at first with a Roman architect, but soon had his plans adapted by Massart, negotiated through the connections of his new wife, Elizabeth Charlotte d'Orléans, the niece of Louis XIV, and then through Mansart's pupil, Germain Beaufrin. The Duke also laid plans for the construction of a new opera house, again using an Italian, Francesco Bibbiena, a designer who had been favorite at his uncle's court back in Vienna. The Ducal Palace in Nancy had initially been rebuilt for Duke René II in a flamboyant Gothic style of the early 16th century. We have images of this palace that show in particular its terraced garden built into the inner walls of the city ramparts. Leopold tore much of this palace down and made plans for a new grand residence. But the War of Spanish Succession led to a reoccupation of Nancy by French armies, so Leopold was forced to move his court to Luneville, about a day's ride to the southeast, and the plans for the new palace at Nancy were temporarily scrapped and then, in fact, never realized. Two other princely sites here were therefore spared. One was the Cordeliers Church, or the Franciscans Church next door, which is a fairly modest, very simple building until you walk into the chapel of Notre-Dame de Lorette in the back, a dynastic necropolis built by Duke Charles III in about 1610 that is remarkably similar to that of Florence, where his daughter Christina was now Grand Duchess of Tuscany. The other thing that was not destroyed by Leopold, though probably planned to be, is the magnificent broad thoroughfare known as La Carrière. Built in the 16th century to host tournaments and festivals, its sides were lined with grand new townhouses built by the local nobility. This part of Nancy had to wait until Stanislas refocused attentions once again on the development of Nancy as part of his plans for the Place Royale and its grand new public buildings. These were designed by his favorite architect, Emmanuel Héré, a pupil of Beaufrin. Stanislas and Héré created a truly royal square in the 1750s, which surely was admired and emulated by princes all across Europe and is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site. On a more modest scale, the ancient castle of Bar-le-Duc, here's Luneville, had also been refashioned by René II in the 16th century, and as a fortified castle on a hilltop in a narrow valley, it became rather a storage place or a place for soldiers, and in particular, they stored the ducal archives there as a much more secure location. A new chateau had been built there by Charles III in the 1560s, but mostly this town was abandoned in the 17th century, then burned, its fortifications dismantled, and its ducal buildings lay empty until the arrival of Jacobite court, which I'll talk about in a moment. So Bar-le-Duc has to wait for a bit. Instead, Leopold focused his attentions on the Chateau of Luneville. It had been part of the ducal domain since the 13th century and had a medieval chateau, extensive hunting grounds, etc. And it had been rebuilt as a Renaissance castle by Charles III and Henri II, then destroyed during the French occupation in the 1630s. Leopold and his architect Beaufrin therefore rebuilt it almost entirely between 1702 and 1723. Inside, there were visual symbols of the dynasty everywhere, notably the double cross of Lorraine and the heraldic bird known as the Alérion, plus visual reminders of the heroic battles fought by the Duke's father at Vienna, Buda, and Belgrade in the previous decade. Much of the palace was a semi-public space with elements of Versailles etiquette imported, such as dining in public, but other areas were much more private, more along the lines of imperial residences that Leopold knew as a child in Vienna or Innsbruck. Beaufrin's beautiful chapel was completed around 1720. About this time, however, the Duke's finances became strained and the final projected wing was never completed. On this side of the chateau, facing the river, He built instead a grand canal and a sunken garden known as Les Rochers. As the garden was extended by the designer Yves-XIXe, a disciple of Le Nôtre, it also included a section called Les Bosquets, with trees and boxwood shrubs, as you can see in this painting. Leopold also employed Beaufort in several smaller chateaux. Not far from Nancy was the small hunting lodge of Malgrange. Sorry, that's the next one. Near the site of before I leave Luneville, Stanislas had inherited the gardens and the plans at Luneville and extended the gardens much, much further in the 1740s, employing Héré once again to construct some true marvels in the gardens at Luneville, notably a pavillon de cascade, seen here, and a garden that had what is described as 88 water-powered mechanical automatons, but I don't really know very much what these were. He also made small maisonettes for his favorites, much like you see at Marly, a Chinese pagoda, and a kiosk, which is a sort of Turkish pavilion, thought to be the first of its kind in France. All right, Malgrange. Beaufort, very busy at this time, also built several smaller chateaux for Leopold. Not far from Nancy was the small hunting lodge of Malgrange. Duke Charles IV, when he was restored in the 1660s during the French occupations, actually resided here since the Ducal Palace still had French soldiers in it and Luneville had been burned down. So for a time, Malgrange was actually the center of the ducal government. It was rebuilt again by Stanislas and was one of his favorite residences. He housed his favorites there, first the Duke Ossolinski, his companion of arms from Poland, and then his long-term mistress, the Marquise de Boufflers, but then most of it was dismantled by the end of the century. So unfortunately, we have really nothing to see at Malgrange. Another residence for a mistress was the Chateau De Cao, which we have as a model here, alas, that's all. Built at one extremity of the park of Luneville by Beaufort, starting in 1712 for Leopold's best friend, Marc de Beauvau-Craon, and his wife, Anne-Marguerite de Ligneville, who was also the Duke's mistress for most of his reign. This small maison de plaisance often served as a secondary court setting for the Duke and his friends. It too had gardens, stables, and so on, so should be considered amongst the royal sites of this duchy. The Duke also commissioned the rebuilding of the Beauvau-Craon Castle, the seat of their marquisate, at Arouet, a short journey south of Nancy, and this is still today one of the great treasures to visit in Lorraine. The daughter of the Beauvau-Craon couple inherited this Chateau de Cao, and she married another ducal favorite, the Prince of Lixheim, or Lixin, who was a member of the cadet branches of the House of Lorraine, several of whom returned to Lorraine at the start of the reign of Duke Leopold. To attract these distant cousins back to his court from Versailles, he gave them top jobs in his household and extensive estates. One of these, known as Acrègne, was renamed Guise and was erected into a principality. This castle too, therefore, was an alternative space for patronage and would remain so, along with the Chateau of Gondrecourt, built by the Duc d'Elbeuf, even into the reign of Stanislas, which I think is another interesting overlap. Towards the end of his life, Leopold built yet another new chateau, also on the outskirts of the gardens of Luneville, for his youngest son, Charles Alexandre, known as La Favorite, or the Chateau Du Paschal. And this is its sort of sad, dilapidated state today. But places like the new Principality of Guise was not really a principality in terms of having regalian rights or claims to sovereignty. Before wrapping up this survey, therefore, we need to look at the curious example of the Principality of Commercy. The small town of Commercy on the Meuse had a castle from the early 13th century. Its early lords were partly dependent on the Bishop of Metz and partly on the Count of Champagne, and used this kind of vagueness to actually proclaim their sovereignty by the early modern period. The name even of the town means on the march or the frontier. And it thus served as a really good retreat in the 1660s for an out-of-favor Cardinal de Retz after the Fronde, who then sold it to the Princess of Lillebonne, a natural daughter of one of the Dukes of Lorraine. By 1708, it passed to her brother, the Prince of Vaudémont, who made use of its status as a sovereign territory to create his own princely court, having been denied the Dukedom of Lorraine itself, as he was also questionable legitimacy. He rebuilt the chateau on a grand scale with extensive waterworks and a pleasure pavilion in its gardens. His court thus served as yet another alternative space for court culture in the reign of Duke Leopold, and he hosted festivals and theaters to which the Duke and his court were sometimes invited. Another important guest at Commercy at this time was the Old Pretender, James Edward Stuart, who lived nearby at the Chateau of Bar-le-Duc from 1713 to 1716. The Jacobite court occupied the ancient capital of the Duchy of Bar, renting houses where they could, but benefiting from the hospitality of Leopold of Lorraine as well. So here you can see the old chateau up on the top of the hill and the remaining buildings today. When the ducal family of Lorraine left the region in 1737, first for Tuscany, then Vienna, the Dowager Duchess, Elizabeth Charlotte d'Orléans, did not wish to leave. According to the terms of the Treaty of Vienna of 1736, she was granted the right to stay at Commercy as a sovereign. So yet again, there was an alternative court culture here, where she lived with her daughter, the Abbess of Remiremont, who was known as Anne Charlotte de Lorraine. She lived with her mother until 1744, then moved on to live with her brother in Vienna, and then her other brother in Brussels. Nevertheless, even at the height of the reign of King Stanislas, she ensured that the original dynasty kept its influence in the region by rebuilding her abbatial palace in Remiremont in the 1750s on a grand scale. Today, it's the mairie of the town. This would be the very last architectural monument to the dynasty that had ruled this region since the 11th century. After the Dowager Duchess died, King Stanislas loved staying at the Chateau of Commercy. Here, he and his friends could enjoy a much more relaxed etiquette. He made additions to the parks, including a Chateau d'Eu, this grand pavilion, this royal pavilion. But most of these features were soon demolished once the French took over fully after 1766. Stanislas had improved the town of Nancy, as we've seen, but also the town of Luneville, with a new theater, originally built by Elizabeth Charlotte, new churches, public library, and laboratories for his favorite scientists. After 1766, the only court culture in Lorraine remained those of the three bishops, who were finally joined by a bishop of Nancy in the 1770s, plus the miniature courts of the princes of Salm, Saarverden, and up further in the Vosges Mountains. The overabundance of princely spaces for court culture, Lorrainers, Poles, Jacobites, bishops, abbesses, and imperial princes, came to an end, and many of their buildings disappeared physically, but even in most of local memory. Thank you.